In this section, we will approach the subject more scientifically. It may be groundbreaking for you to understand scientifically and psychologically those processes that take place in us, our brains, and our bodies when we are about to separate. We will start with a bit of theory. Specifically, we will talk about the hormones secreted in us. The moment we initially fall in love, we have a dopamine cocktail. This is the chemical that, first of all, gives us a lot of mobilization and focus. It is thanks to dopamine that our human species is guaranteed to survive. When we fall in love, we generally strive hard for our reward. Dopamine is the substance that gives us a sense of reward satisfaction when we meet the object of our infatuation. It's what makes us so focused on getting someone, on being with someone, and it's also what makes us able to build a real relationship in the long run. Here, we can move on to the second hormone, the love hormone, oxytocin, which affects us differently, as it is much more a calm substance and responsible for building a long-term relationship with someone. We can say that oxytocin guarantees us a feeling of true love and attachment to a person. It is interesting to note that oxytocin grows in us not only when this bond with the person we are with is correct. When a relationship enters a crisis phase, increased amounts of oxytocin are also generated in the person who decides to fight for the relationship. Paradoxically, when our partner begins to move away from us, we feel that this feeling of true love in us grows. This paradox misleads us a bit because later, we will fall from a higher pitch if our relationship does not survive this crisis. When a relationship breaks down, we enter the protest phase. The protest phase is that dopamine and norepinephrine, the two substances responsible for such strong motivation to act in us, increase. We get motivated to get that person back. That's why we want to fight so much, and that's why we don't accept that someone doesn't wish to be with us anymore. By way of trivia, this phenomenon is so very evolutionarily determined. We inherited it from all mammals, which reacted this way in the moment when, for example, they were abandoned by the herd or got lost somewhere. This dopamine and adrenaline were needed for this mammal to feel such an urge to look for this herd, to return to it, and thanks to this very survival, because such a small mammal on its own has a meager chance of survival. After the phase of protest, when the dopamine and norepinephrine in us have risen, and it turns out that it is impossible to get that person back, we enter the phase of resignation. In this melancholy state, it occurs to us that there will be no reward. Suddenly, dopamine goes down, adrenaline goes down, and cortisol, the stress hormone, goes up, which causes us to have depressive states and insomnia, and to a large extent, inhibits dopamine. We enter a phase of lethargy. We don't want anything, and are unhappy. There are studies where the brains of people who have separated over the last year were X-rayed. They subjected their brains to MRIs and looked at what was going on in those brains. It was proven that the same area in our brains that is responsible for physical suffering is activated, meaning that we feel like we're being torn apart, that our heart is breaking, and that everything hurts. The suffering we feel after a breakup is 100% comparable to physical anguish. One last thing to understand in the context of what happens in our body when we part with someone is how dopamine affects our brain. Studies show that it affects our brain in the same way that it builds the same pathways in our brain as we have when we take cocaine, which makes dopamine a very addictive substance. The moment we are weaned from our reward, that is, we part with the person we love, then we react the same as a person who is addicted to cocaine. That is, all the same symptoms like insomnia or nervousness appear. Our body has to go through a detox in some way. This detox is most often a tough road, full of tears, unhappiness, and various ways with which we try to help ourselves. It is essential to understand that we can help ourselves. People who suffer during a breakup often reach for such short-term ways to raise the level of the happiness hormone because, after a breakup, it drops sharply. Most often we reach for alcohol, something that, in the short term of course, raises dopamine. Gambling and even shopping also cause us such quick dopamine boosts. In the long term, these solutions cannot help us at all. Another thing we often do after a breakup is use social media, following that person and looking at that person's photos on mobile. As it turns out, this causes oxytocin to rise every time we look at the person we care about. The truth is, however, that there will also be a clash with that person's reality somewhere in the end. We are shooting ourselves in the knee because we are artificially generating the maintenance of this bond, which somewhere out there should begin slowly being buried by us. We should help ourselves be less attached to this person, not more and more. The last thing that is not exactly a good solution when we want to help ourselves feel better is antidepressants. Of course, there are situations where someone goes through a bad breakup and goes to a psychiatrist. It turns out that this person is diagnosed with depression. In this condition, her body no longer generates the happiness hormone serotonin, which is responsible for a stable sense of happiness. Then, of course, such people need to be helped, for the reason that such a person may not be able to cope with all this on his own, who is truly depressed. I'm not talking about such a loose use of the word depression, but we are talking about an actual disease in the form of depression, where our body stops generating the happiness hormone at all. There is no other way sometimes, but it is often the case, and this is something we need to remember when we reach for these antidepressants that are based on serotonin too quickly. The thing that is inherent in serotonin is that it inhibits dopamine. That is, if we increase dopamine, serotonin decreases and vice versa. In the long run, if we take antidepressants, our body, even after we stop taking them, is not able to secrete dopamine as efficiently. And as we well know, dopamine is something inherent to make us feel in love. It can be said that if we take antidepressants for an extended period, it will be harder for us to get involved in some new relationship after even stopping them. But there are other ways to adjust these happiness hormones in us in the long run. Endorphins are the hormone that is responsible for that feeling that you can go on, and for motivation as to how to deal with pain, and he can mute that pain in general. Of course, the easiest method to generate these endorphins is exercise and physical activity, preferably outdoors, because the sun also causes our bodies to release happiness hormones. Listening to instrumental music, singing, and dancing also causes endorphin generation. Also, all creative processes are where we decide to paint something, create something, sculpt something, write a poem, or cook something. All activities where we decide to work creatively in some way will cause us to generate happiness hormones. To raise our dopamine concentration, we can set realistic goals and achieve them. Dopamine is produced every time we succeed in achieving a goal. It doesn't matter whether it's a small or big goal, so I recommend pursuing small goals because it gives you a more excellent guarantee of satisfaction that you've achieved something. It's also worth writing down these goals for ourselves, and this is such a quick method to give ourselves such a shot of dopamine because each ticking off a goal from the completed list causes a genuine rise in dopamine in our body. It is worth doing this when you are just after a breakup. Another method is to surround yourself with the closest people. Someone might think that this is nonsense, but it is just not such obvious advice. Once you understand the nature of all these chemical processes that occur in us, you will also know that the presence of another person, his closeness, hugging, looking the other person in the eyes, your loved ones, your friends, your family, actually also causes the release of oxytocin in our body. The cool thing is that pets have the same effect on us. It's worth dropping in on a friend with a friendly dog or cat, and it's worth buying yourself such a life companion too, if you're having such a sadder time in life. I also encourage you to do this as much as possible. You will still have double the joy of doing such a nice deed by taking in a pet. Another thing I suggest to you is all the meditations, calming, all the yoga-type exercises. It is scientifically stated that they affect the lowering of cortisol in the body and the production of all those happiness hormones. Another issue is, in general, the question of regulating this hormonal economy, because two essential factors affect the fact that this hormonal economy in our body runs properly: a healthy diet and sleep. This insomnia is such a fundamental problem in periods when we are after a breakup. We overthink and can't fall asleep often. So as it were, it is also essential to try to take care of sleep hygiene and eat healthily. Don't let this challenging period you are going through affect the other adverse effects. For example, you may stop taking care of yourself and somehow neglect this physical sphere. This is also a frequent side effect that everything in our body falls apart. We either overeat, eat unhealthily, or reach for some stimulants. Somehow we need to find that motivation and stop prolonging that period where we sit alone at home, complain, cry, or find that we feel a lot of suffering, a lot of pain, which doesn't necessarily mean, and tell ourselves that it was the love of our life. This may be a sign that this is how our body reacts, that all those hormones have subsided for us, and this is the body's normal reaction. Knowing this, you can force yourself to take responsibility for everything happening now, and use this opportunity to change your life. There is one last thing you can add to all this. Maybe not necessarily at the very beginning, but once you feel a little better, It is to open up to what is new, to new passions, new interests, also to new people, new acquaintances, and new friends, because new experiences cause the release of dopamine in our body. This is such a school of coping with a breakup, so step by step, even though we often don't have the strength and desire to get out of the hole. Sometimes it may be that you feel like being sad, but at some point, there comes a moment when you have to force yourself and mobilize yourself. You may drag this period out while still protesting or in despair. You may think to yourself that you are suffering so much because you have just lost the love of your life. It's a normal thing that after a breakup, these kinds of processes happen in our body, that it hurts and that it's hard for us, that we want to go back to our partner, that we protest, that we are torn apart by pain and have no energy for anything. You can tell yourself that it will always be like this, because you have already lost the love of your life forever. Or you can take this life into your own hands and find that you can help yourself through all these activities that will help you rebuild those happiness hormones in yourself and regulate this life of yours. The wonderful thing is that on the one hand, you will live better and better biologically, and on the other hand also mentally, because your life will stop being about lying down and crying, but loading into it with small steps, more and more self-love, more and more cool things, incredible adventures, cool people. I invite you to the next section. If you liked the material, leave a like and send it to a friend or someone close to you who may benefit from this knowledge. If you want to support our work and help us create more valuable videos, there is a link in the description.